April 19th, 1945. Somewhere in the Ruhr Pocket, Germany, Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner crouched in the rubble of what had been a machine shop, his Sturmgewehr 44 cradled against his chest. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, but knowing and accepting were different things. Through the shattered window, he watched American infantry advance down the street, their boots crunching over broken glass and spent shell casings. What caught his attention wasn't their numbers or their tactics. It was their weapons. One GI carried something that looked like it had been assembled in a plumber's workshop, a crude tube of stamped metal with a wire stock that collapsed like a carpenter's ruler. No wood, no polish, no craftsmanship whatsoever. Steiner had been trained at the Wehrmacht's finest small arms school. He knew the MP40, could disassemble it blindfolded, understood its elegant engineering. This American weapon looked like an insult to the profession of arms. Yet, as the firefight erupted, that ugly piece of metal spoke with brutal efficiency. Short, controlled bursts. No jamming, no hesitation. When Steiner was finally captured 3 hours later, hands zip-tied behind his back, he couldn't stop staring at the weapon his captor carried. The American sergeant noticed his gaze and grinned. "Never seen a grease gun before, Fritz?" he asked in broken German. Steiner shook his head. The sergeant ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber with practiced ease, and held it out for inspection. $20, he said, switching to English as another soldier translated. "That's what this cost to make, $20 American. Steiner's mind reeled. $20. His MP40 had cost the Reich over 60 Reichsmarks to produce, equivalent to nearly $40 at pre-war exchange rates. And this stamped steel monstrosity cost half that. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The implications hit him like artillery fire. If America could arm its soldiers with weapons this cheap, this simple, this effective, then Germany had never stood a chance. Not against their industrial capacity, not against their willingness to abandon tradition for pure functionality. That crude weapon wasn't just a gun, it was a philosophy made manifest. And in that moment, standing in the ruins of the Ruhr, Steiner understood what his superiors had refused to acknowledge. The war had been decided not on battlefields, but in factories, not by superior tactics, but by superior production. The autumn of 1942 found the German military establishment at the height of its confidence. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland, humiliated France, and carved deep into the Soviet Union. German engineering had produced the finest weapons in the world: the MG-42 machine gun, the 88mm flak gun, the Tiger tank. Each was a masterpiece of precision manufacturing, a testament to centuries of Germanic craftsmanship. In weapons procurement offices across Berlin, officers spoke reverently of Waffenqualität, the quality of arms. A German soldier, they believed, deserved tools worthy of his training and sacrifice. This meant machined receivers, hand-fitted components, and materials selected for durability and appearance. The MP40 submachine gun embodied this philosophy perfectly. Designed by Heinrich Vollmer and produced by Irma Werker, it featured a folding stock, a machined steel receiver, and a blowback mechanism that was both elegant and reliable. Production required skilled gunsmiths and precision tooling. Each weapon took approximately 30 hours to manufacture, with multiple stages of machining, fitting, and finishing. The cost per unit hovered around 60 Reichsmarks, a substantial investment in 1942's economy. But German military doctrine considered this acceptable. Quality over quantity. Precision over speed. A well-made weapon in the hands of a trained soldier was worth 10 crude firearms carried by conscripts. This belief system ran deep in German military culture. It traced back to the Prussian tradition of excellence, the philosophy that superior training, superior equipment, and superior discipline could overcome numerical disadvantages. Throughout the first years of World War II, this doctrine had proven remarkably successful. Smaller German forces had consistently defeated larger Allied armies through superior tactics and equipment, but by late 1942, cracks were beginning to show. The Eastern Front devoured men and materiel at rates that exceeded German industry's capacity to replace them. The Soviets had evacuated their factories east of the Urals and were producing weapons at scales Germany couldn't match. The PPSH-41 submachine gun, crude by German standards, was being manufactured by the hundreds of thousands. Each one cost the Soviets approximately $5 in raw materials and labor. German intelligence reports noted this disparity, but the implications were dismissed. Soviet weapons were considered inferior, unreliable, unworthy of a professional military. The fact that they worked well enough to kill German soldiers seemed less important than maintaining manufacturing standards. This intellectual blindness would prove catastrophic, because across the Atlantic, American engineers were about to demolish every assumption about weapons production that Germany held sacred. In October of 1942, as German forces pushed toward Stalingrad, a man named George Hyde sat in an office at General Motors' Inland Division in Dayton, Ohio. He had been given an impossible assignment by the United States Army. Design a submachine gun that performs like the Thompson, costs 1/10 as much, and can be ready for mass production in 7 months. The Thompson submachine gun, beloved by American troops, and gangsters alike, cost $200 per unit to manufacture. It was beautiful, reliable, and completely impractical for equipping millions of soldiers. Hyde understood something that German engineers refused to contemplate. In modern industrial warfare, good enough manufactured quickly beats perfect manufactured slowly. He began sketching designs that violated every traditional gunsmithing principle. Instead of machined receivers, he drew stamped sheet metal components that could be pressed in automotive plants. Instead of wooden stocks, he planned wireframes and pressed steel. Instead of precision-fitted parts requiring skilled assembly, he designed tolerances loose enough that any factory worker could put the weapon together. The result was the 20 prototype, later designated the M3 submachine gun. It looked absolutely terrible. A cylindrical tube welded from 2 stamped halves, a wire stock that telescoped like an antenna, a dust cover that doubled as the safety mechanism. No wood, no polish, no craftsmanship. It resembled an automotive grease gun so strongly that soldiers immediately nicknamed it exactly that, the grease gun. But it worked. It fired the same .45 ACP cartridge as the Thompson, with comparable accuracy. Its slower rate of fire, around 450 rounds per minute versus the Thompson's 700, actually improved controllability and conserved ammunition. The enclosed receiver kept mud and debris out better than the Thompson's open bolt design. Most importantly, it cost approximately $20 to manufacture. German intelligence received reports about the new American weapon in early 1943. The technical analysis was dismissive. Crude construction, one report noted, appears to be expedient wartime measure, unlikely to perform reliably in field conditions. Indicates American industrial capacity prioritizes quantity over quality. The report recommended continued production of MP-40 using traditional methods. After all, German weapons were superior. That's what mattered. What German analysts failed to grasp was that the M3 represented a revolution in military-industrial thinking. America had weaponized its automotive industry, turning car factories into armories overnight. The same presses that stamped fenders could stamp receivers. The same welders who assembled chassis could weld gun bodies. Workers with no gunsmithing experience could be trained to assemble M3s in days rather than months. By mid-1943, multiple American factories were producing thousands of M3s weekly. Guide Lamp Division in Anderson, Indiana, converted from headlight manufacturing to submachine gun production in weeks. The same production line flexibility that made America's automobile industry dominant now made its weapons production unstoppable. Each factory operated 3 shifts daily. Workers, many of them women, assembled weapons with the efficiency of an automotive assembly line. Parts were stamped, pressed, and welded in minutes. Quality control focused on function rather than finish. If it fired reliably, it passed inspection. The German response, when reports of American production capacity finally penetrated the Reich's bureaucracy, was disbelief, followed by denial. Impossible, declared one weapons procurement officer. No serious military can rely on stamped metal weapons. They will fail in combat conditions. The prejudice ran deeper than tactical concerns. It touched on fundamental questions of national identity and military culture. German weapons were supposed to be better because Germans were supposed to be better. Superior engineering reflected superior people. To abandon craftsmanship for mass production felt like cultural surrender. This ideological rigidity would cost Germany dearly. While German factories struggled to replace weapons lost on the Eastern Front, American production accelerated. While German gunsmiths hand-fitted MP40 components, American workers stamped out M3 receivers by the thousands. While German doctrine insisted on quality, American pragmatism embraced quantity. Obergefreiter Steiner, who would eventually face an M3 in the Ruhr Pocket, was being trained on the MP40 in 1943. His instructors taught him to respect his weapon, to maintain it meticulously, to understand its mechanical elegance. They told him that German equipment was the finest in the world. They told him that superior training and superior weapons would overcome any numerical disadvantage. They never told him that America was outproducing Germany by factors of 10 or more across nearly every category of military equipment. By 1944, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. Germany was retreating on all fronts, its industry crippled by Allied bombing, its resource base shrinking daily. Yet, weapons procurement still prioritized traditional manufacturing methods. The MP40 continued in production alongside newer designs like the Sturmgewehr 44, each requiring substantial machining and skilled labor. Attempts to develop cheaper alternatives, like the MP3000, came too late and in too few numbers to matter. Meanwhile, American soldiers were receiving M3s in quantity. The weapons appeared throughout the European and Pacific theaters, issued primarily to vehicle crews, paratroopers, and officers who needed compact firepower. Initial reactions were mixed. Soldiers accustomed to the Thompson's solid weight and polished appearance found the grease gun unappealing. It felt cheap, looked crude, and lacked the psychological reassurance of a finely crafted weapon. But in combat, opinions changed rapidly. The M3 worked. It worked in Italian mud, where Thompsons choked on debris. It worked in Pacific jungles, where humidity rusted everything. It worked in winter conditions that froze more complex mechanisms. Solid. Tank crews loved it because it fit inside cramped turrets. Paratroopers appreciated its collapsible stock. Infantry discovered that its slower rate of fire made ammunition last longer in extended firefights. German soldiers encountering the weapon in battle found themselves confused by its effectiveness. How could something so crude work so well? The answer lay in fundamental design philosophy. The M3 had been engineered not for elegance, but for reliability under the worst possible conditions. Its heavy bolt and enclosed action meant fewer moving parts to break or foul. Its stamped construction meant tolerances were actually looser than machined weapons, allowing it to function even when dirty or damaged. One after-action report from the Italian campaign told a revealing story. An American tank crew's M3 had fallen into a river crossing. After retrieval, they simply shook out the water, wiped down the exterior, and continued using it without disassembly or maintenance. It fired without malfunction. A German soldier who witnessed this through binoculars wrote in his diary, "Their weapons are toys, but toys that never break." This disconnect between appearance and performance baffled German military thinking. Weapons were supposed to look serious, substantial, well-made. The M3 looked like stamped plumbing, yet it performed better under field conditions than weapons costing 3 times as much to produce. The cognitive dissonance was profound. If crude stamped metal could match or exceed precision machining, What did that say about German assumptions regarding quality and craftsmanship? The question went unanswered because asking it would require confronting uncomfortable truths. German industry in 1944 lacked the capacity for wholesale conversion to mass production methods. The automotive sector was smaller and less flexible than America's. Machine tool production couldn't match demand. Skilled labor was being conscripted into combat units faster than replacements could be trained. Even if Germany had wanted to copy American production methods, the infrastructure and expertise weren't available. More fundamentally, German military culture resisted the entire concept. Officers who had built careers on understanding traditional weapons felt threatened by industrial pragmatism, accepting that a $20 stamped gun could outperform a 60 Reichsmark machined weapon meant accepting that their expertise was obsolete. Institutional inertia, personal pride, and ideological commitment to quality combined to prevent the kind of radical rethinking that might have helped Germany's deteriorating situation. By early 1945, when Steiner found himself fighting in the Ruhr industrial region, the war's outcome was inevitable. Germany's vaunted industrial heartland was being systematically dismantled by Allied bombing and ground offensives. Factories that had once produced precision, weapons now stood as burned-out shells. Supply lines had collapsed. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement equipment arrived sporadically, if at all. The American forces closing in carried M3s alongside their Monet Garands and Browning automatic rifles. These weapons had been produced in quantities that German industry could never match. An entire logistical system supported them, delivering ammunition, spare parts, and replacement weapons as needed. American soldiers could afford to be careless with equipment because more was always available. German soldiers hoarded every round, maintained their weapons obsessively, and knew that losses couldn't be replaced. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When Steiner finally held an M3 after his capture, examining its crude construction and simple mechanism, he experienced a revelation that many German soldiers shared in those final months. The weapon in his hands represented everything Germany had dismissed as inferior: stamped metal instead of machined steel, wire instead of wood, function without elegance. Yet it had helped defeat the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. The cost differential was staggering when examined closely. An MP40 required approximately 30 hours of skilled labor to manufacture, using machined components and precision assembly. An M3 required fewer than 5 hours of semi-skilled labor, using stamped parts and simple welding. Material costs favored the M3 even more dramatically. Steel requirements were lower, no wood was needed, and fewer precision-machined components meant less waste and faster throughput. Scale these differences across hundreds of thousands of weapons, and the strategic implications became clear. America could arm its entire military with effective submachine guns, while spending less total resources than Germany spent arming, a fraction of its forces. This production advantage extended across nearly every category of military equipment. Tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft. American industry outproduced German industry by factors that made numerical comparison almost meaningless. The M3's $20 production cost symbolized a broader American advantage in industrial warfare. By abandoning traditional craftsmanship for functional design and mass production, American industry had created a system that German industry couldn't match even in peacetime, much less under wartime conditions. Every M3 produced represented resources that could be allocated elsewhere. Every hour saved in manufacturing meant more weapons in soldiers' hands sooner. German military leadership had understood numbers abstractly but failed to grasp their concrete implications. Reports showing American production capacity were filed and forgotten, dismissed as propaganda or statistical manipulation. The idea that America could produce 10 times more weapons, vehicles, and equipment than Germany seemed impossible, so it was treated as impossible. Even when evidence mounted throughout 1943 and 1944, cognitive biases prevented accurate assessment. This willful blindness extended to weapons evaluation. When German soldiers reported that American equipment, despite appearing crude, performed reliably under field conditions, these reports were filtered through prejudice. American weapons work adequately for American soldiers, one analyst concluded, but would not meet German standards. The circular reasoning was perfect. German standards required expensive production methods. Therefore, expensive production methods were necessary. Therefore, cheap production was inadequate by definition. The M3 grease gun demolished this logic through sheer battlefield effectiveness. It didn't just work adequately. In many conditions, it worked better than weapons costing 3 times as much. Its enclosed action resisted fouling better than the MP40's open bolt design. Its slower rate of fire conserved ammunition while maintaining combat effectiveness. Its stamped construction made it lighter to carry and easier to replace when damaged. Its simple mechanism meant field maintenance required minimal training and no special tools. These advantages compounded over time and across millions of soldiers. An army equipped with M3s could operate with less logistical support, fewer trained armourers, and more replaceable components than an army equipped with MP40s. In sustained combat, these operational advantages mattered more than individual weapon characteristics. A soldier with a reliable, easily maintained weapon he could actually get ammunition for, beat a soldier with a technically superior weapon that was difficult to support in the field. Steiner understood this instinctively as he examined the captured M3 in April of 1945. The war hadn't been lost because German soldiers lacked courage or skill. It had been lost because Germany's entire industrial and military philosophy was designed for a different kind of conflict. Germany had prepared to fight short, decisive campaigns where superior tactics and equipment would achieve quick victory. The war that actually occurred demanded sustained industrial mobilization, logistical superiority, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. America excelled at exactly this kind of warfare. Its continental geography was immune to strategic bombing. Its industrial base was vast and flexible. Its population was large enough to sustain military and industrial labor simultaneously. Its cultural pragmatism embraced whatever worked rather than whatever looked proper. The M3 grease gun embodied all these advantages in $20 worth of stamped steel and wire. The weapon's ugliness was not a bug, but a feature. By abandoning aesthetic considerations entirely, designers had focused purely on function. Every component existed for a reason. Every manufacturing choice optimized for speed and cost. The result was a weapon that looked like it had been assembled in a garage, but performed like it had been designed by geniuses. Which, in a sense, it had been. The genius lay not in mechanical innovation, but in recognizing that modern warfare rewarded production capacity over individual craftsmanship. German weapons designers had possessed the technical knowledge to create similar weapons. The MP3000, developed late in the war, used stamped construction and simplified manufacturing, but it appeared too late and in too few numbers to affect outcomes. German industry's capacity had been degraded by years of strategic bombing. Machine tools were scarce. Skilled labor had been conscripted. Raw materials were allocated to priority weapons systems like tanks and aircraft. By the time German leadership recognized the need for cheap, mass-produced infantry weapons, the war was already lost. This timing issue was not accidental. Industrial systems have tremendous inertia. Changing production methods requires investment, training, and time. America began converting to war production in 1941, giving it years to optimize processes before peak mobilization demands. Germany, already at war and resource-constrained, couldn't afford the temporary production drops that retooling required. The decisions made in peacetime about industrial organization and military doctrine locked both nations into trajectories that determined wartime outcomes years later. The M3 represented American decisions made before Pearl Harbor. Industrial mobilization plans developed in the 1930s. Automotive industry expansion that created flexible manufacturing capacity, a military procurement system willing to prioritize cost and speed over appearance and tradition. These foundational choices made the grease gun possible, both technically and culturally. Without that groundwork, even the most brilliant weapons designer couldn't have achieved what George Hyde accomplished in Dayton, Ohio. Conversely, Germany's weapons procurement reflected decisions made in the 1920s and 30s, a focus on quality and craftsmanship, industrial policies favoring precision manufacturing, military doctrine emphasizing superior equipment and training. These choices had worked well in short campaigns, but proved catastrophic in sustained total war. The institutional momentum behind them was so strong that even obvious problems couldn't force course corrections until far too late. The spring of 1945 brought Germany's military collapse into sharp focus. As Allied forces converged from east and west, German soldiers found themselves facing enemies equipped with seemingly endless supplies of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. The contrast with their own dwindling resources was stark and demoralizing. Obergefreiter Klaus Steiner, now a prisoner of war being processed at a temporary camp near Remagen, watched American soldiers handle their equipment with casual indifference that would have horrified any German quartermaster. M3s were stacked against trucks like firewood. Ammunition crates sat open in the rain. One soldier used his grease gun's wire stock to pry open a ration box, then tossed the weapon carelessly onto a jeep seat. To Steiner, raised in a military culture that treated weapons as sacred trusts, this carelessness was shocking. Yet he also recognized what it represented. These soldiers could afford to be casual because their supply chain was so robust that individual weapons were essentially disposable. In the POW camp, German soldiers traded stories about American equipment. A panzer crewman described watching American tank crews abandon damaged Shermans without even attempting to recover their weapons. "They just left everything," he said, still, disbelieving weeks later. Grease guns, ammunition, tools, like it was garbage. An infantry sergeant who had fought in the Ardennes offensive described American positions overflowing with equipment. "They had more weapons than men," he said quietly. "Extra grease guns just lying in foxholes. We were rationing every round." These anecdotes painted a picture of material abundance that German soldiers had never experienced. Throughout the war, German doctrine had emphasized equipment preservation and recovery. Weapons were maintained meticulously, damaged equipment was repaired whenever possible, and losses were tracked carefully because replacements were scarce. American forces operated under completely different assumptions. Equipment was abundant, replaceable, and subordinate to mission accomplishment. If a weapon was lost or damaged, another would arrive shortly. This mindset reflected industrial capacity that German soldiers struggled to comprehend. The numbers, when Steiner finally learned them through camp rumors and later confirmation, were staggering. America had produced over 600,000 M3 submachine guns during the war. Germany had manufactured approximately 1 million MP40s, but at 3 times the cost per unit and requiring vastly more skilled labor. When production hours were calculated, American industry had generated equivalent firepower using approximately 1/3 the total labor input of German industry. That efficiency advantage extended across the entire war economy. American automotive plants had converted to weapons production with remarkable speed. Guide Lamp Division, Buffalo Arms Corporation, and other manufacturers with no previous firearms experience were producing thousands of M3s monthly by mid-1943. The same flexibility that made American automobile production dominant in peacetime made American weapons production overwhelming in wartime. Factories could retool rapidly, workers could be trained quickly, and production could scale almost without limit. German industry possessed no equivalent flexibility. Weapons manufacturing remained concentrated in specialized facilities, requiring skilled gunsmiths and precision machinists. When Allied bombing destroyed these facilities, production couldn't be easily relocated or distributed. When skilled workers were conscripted for combat, their expertise couldn't be quickly replaced. The industrial system optimized for quality and craftsmanship proved brittle under wartime stress. Tank crew testimonials provided particularly striking evidence of the M3's practical advantages. Panzer Commander Hans Müller, captured near Aachen in October of 1944, described watching American Sherman crews exit their tanks carrying grease guns after an engagement. "The weapon is so compact it doesn't interfere with movement inside the tank," he noted in a statement given to intelligence officers. "Our MP-40s were too long for convenient carry in our panzers. We often left them behind and relied on pistols. This seemingly minor ergonomic advantage had significant tactical implications. Tank crews equipped with submachine guns could defend their vehicles effectively against infantry assault. Crews armed only with pistols were vulnerable once buttoned up inside their tanks. The M3's collapsible wire stock made it practical to carry inside cramped armoured vehicles, giving American tank crews a defensive capability German crews lacked. Again, design philosophy made the difference. The M3 had been designed specifically for vehicle crews, with their operational constraints in mind. Paratroopers and airborne infantry provided similar testimony. Fallschirmjäger officer Ernst Hoffmann, who had jumped over Crete in 1941 and fought against American paratroopers in Normandy, observed the difference in equipment philosophy. "Our men carried weapons in containers dropped separately," he explained. "We had to locate and retrieve them after landing, often under fire. The Americans jumped with their weapons. Those grease guns folded small enough to carry during descent without interfering with parachute deployment." This capability gave American airborne forces a crucial advantage in the vulnerable moments immediately after landing. German paratroopers had to spend precious minutes locating weapon containers, assembling equipment, and organizing before they could fight effectively. American paratroopers landed ready for immediate combat. The operational tempo advantage this created often determined whether airborne operations succeeded or failed. Yet again, the M3's crude appearance masked sophisticated design thinking about real-world operational requirements. Infantry soldiers who had fought in close-quarters urban combat praised the M3's reliability under conditions that defeated more complex weapons. Gefreiter Otto Werner, who fought in the ruins of Aachen during house-to-house combat, described the weapon's performance in dust and debris. "Everything was covered in powdered concrete and plaster," he remembered. "Our MP-40s jammed constantly. We spent more time clearing malfunctions than firing. The Americans with those ugly grease guns just kept shooting." The M3's enclosed receiver design proved decisive in urban warfare. Dust and debris that would infiltrate open-bolt weapons couldn't reach the M3's internal mechanism. Its heavy bolt maintained momentum even when internal surfaces became contaminated. The loose tolerances that made German engineers scoff at its crude construction actually allowed it to function when precision-fitted weapons seized. In the environment that mattered, combat conditions, the cheap stamped weapon outperformed the expensive machined one. Winter combat provided equally dramatic validation. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, occurred during one of the coldest winters on record. Temperatures dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit. Weapons oil froze solid. Steel components contracted, tightening already close tolerances. German soldiers found their carefully maintained MP-40s jamming or refusing to fire entirely. Meanwhile, American defenders wielding M3s reported minimal malfunctions. One American after-action report from the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne noted that M3s continued functioning in conditions that disabled other weapons. The grease gun's heavy bolt and slow cyclic rate meant it could chamber rounds even when lubricants froze, the report concluded. Its simple mechanism had fewer points of potential failure in extreme cold. German intelligence analysts who reviewed captured American weapons in early 1945 finally acknowledged what frontline soldiers had been reporting for months. The crude American submachine gun worked better under field conditions than Germany's precision-engineered equivalent. This admission came too late to affect German weapons development or production. By 1945, German industry was collapsing under the weight of strategic bombing, resource shortages, and infrastructure destruction. The Ruhr industrial region, where Steiner had been captured, was being systematically dismantled. Factories that had once produced weapons, vehicles, and ammunition were either bombed out shells or under Allied occupation. Even if German engineers had designed a perfect equivalent to the M3, no capacity existed to manufacture it in meaningful quantities. The cost comparison that Steiner had learned about, $20 American versus 60 Reichsmarks, represented only direct manufacturing expenses. When indirect costs were included, the disparity grew even larger. An MP40 required specialized tooling, skilled labor, and quality control procedures that added overhead beyond simple material and labor costs. The M3, manufactured on converted automotive equipment by semi-skilled workers, carried minimal overhead burden. Total cost per weapon, including all inputs, probably favored the M3 by a factor of 5 to 1 or more. Scale this across hundreds of thousands of weapons, and the resource implications were staggering. Germany had invested enormous industrial capacity into producing precision weapons that America matched or exceeded with a fraction of the investment. Those saved resources went into producing more ammunition, more vehicles, more of everything needed to sustain industrial warfare. The efficiency advantage compounded across every category of military production, creating a material superiority that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. American soldiers' casual treatment of their weapons, which had so shocked Steiner, now made perfect sense. When weapons cost $20 and replacement was guaranteed, treating them as disposable tools rather than precious equipment was rational. When weapons cost 60 Reichsmarks and replacement was unlikely, treating them as irreplaceable heirlooms was equally rational. The economic foundation determined the cultural practice. Material abundance enabled operational flexibility that scarcity prevented. This realization extended beyond weapons to the entire American way of war. Ammunition expenditure, vehicle losses, equipment replacement, everything operated at scales that German logistics couldn't support. American artillery batteries fired thousands of rounds where German batteries fired hundreds. American tank units accepted armor losses that would have paralyzed German panzer divisions. American infantry could call for supply drops that delivered everything from ammunition to fresh clothing. The Wehrmacht's tail-to-teeth ratio, already stretched thin, couldn't support such profligacy even if doctrine had allowed it. German military culture had developed around resource constraints. Efficiency, economy, and preservation were virtues born of necessity. Weapons training emphasized marksmanship because ammunition was limited. Maintenance protocols were strict because replacements were scarce. Tactical doctrine stressed achieving objectives with minimal losses because reinforcements arrived slowly. These constraints had shaped German military effectiveness, forcing innovation and efficiency, but they also created a ceiling that American material abundance simply ignored. The M3 grease gun embodied this fundamental difference in approach. German designers had created the MP40 to be the best submachine gun possible within manufacturing constraints. American designers had created the M3 to be good enough for combat while manufacturing millions of them. The MP40 represented the peak of what German industry could achieve. The M3 represented what American industry considered barely adequate. Yet the barely adequate weapon, produced in overwhelming quantity, proved more decisive than the superior weapon produced in limited numbers. Steiner spent his months in POW camps discussing these issues with fellow prisoners. Officers who had attended staff college tried to explain how Germany might have competed with American production. Their suggestions invariably involved unrealistic assumptions, accessing resources that didn't exist, time that hadn't been available, industrial capacity that couldn't be created. The hard truth, which most prisoners eventually acknowledged, was that Germany had never possessed the industrial base to compete with America in sustained total war. This wasn't a question of intelligence or effort. German engineers were brilliant, German workers were skilled, German organization was efficient. But brilliance, skill, and efficiency couldn't compensate for fundamental differences in scale. America's population was larger, its resource base was broader, its industrial infrastructure was more developed, and its geography was invulnerable to attack. These structural advantages determined outcomes before the first shot was fired. The M3's existence proved this point. America could afford to develop a weapon specifically optimized for cheap mass production because its industrial system could support such specialization. Germany couldn't afford weapons optimized for cost because its industrial system was already strained, producing weapons optimized for performance. The luxury of choosing between quality and quantity belonged to the nation with surplus capacity. Germany possessed no such luxury. By late 1945, Steiner had been transferred to a permanent POW camp in France. The war in Europe had ended, though fighting continued in the Pacific. German prisoners received news through camp newspapers and occasional letters. They learned about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about Japan's surrender, about the scale of destruction their war had caused. Through it all, Steiner kept thinking about that grease gun, that crude, stamped weapon that had symbolized everything he hadn't understood about the conflict. In conversations with other prisoners, he tried to articulate what the weapon meant. "It wasn't just that they could build more than us," he would say. "It's that they knew they didn't need to build the best. Good enough, in huge numbers, was their strategy from the beginning. We were trying to craft masterpieces. They were running an assembly line. Some prisoners understood. Others refused to accept that German weapons hadn't been superior. The cognitive dissonance was too painful. Admitting that crude stamped metal could match precision engineering meant admitting that the entire foundation of German military pride was mistaken. The American guards at the camp carried M3s alongside their Monet Garands and carbines. Steiner watched them handle the weapons with the same casual indifference he'd seen at Remagen. One guard used his grease gun as a seat in the guard tower, sitting on it for hours, without concern. Another threw his across a truck bed, where it clattered among tools and spare parts. The message was clear. This weapon is a tool, nothing more. It has no sacred significance, no cultural meaning. It exists to accomplish a job, and when that job is done, it can be discarded without sentiment. This attitude would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. German soldiers were taught to venerate their weapons, to see them as extensions of themselves, to maintain them as sacred trusts. The cultural weight placed on weapons reflected deeper beliefs about craftsmanship, duty, and the warrior ethos. American pragmatism simply ignored all of that weight. A weapon was a manufactured item. If it worked, use it. If it broke, replace it. No sentiment required. Years later, after his release and return to Germany, Steiner would encounter the M3 again in historical museums and military exhibitions. By then, its role in the war had been thoroughly documented. Production figures, after-action reports, soldier testimonials, all confirmed what he'd intuited in the Ruhr Pocket. The ugly stamped weapon had been one of America's most effective small arms of the war, not because of any technical brilliance, but because its design philosophy perfectly matched America's strategic advantages. The M3 remained in American military service for decades after World War II. It saw combat in Korea, where extreme cold defeated more complex weapons. It appeared in Vietnam, where jungle conditions favored its sealed action. National Guard units carried it into the 1990s. This longevity testified to the soundness of its basic design. Cheap didn't mean disposable. Simple didn't mean fragile. The weapon that had looked like a plumber's mistake proved more durable than many precision-engineered alternatives. German weapons designers in the post-war period studied the M3 as an object lesson. The Bundeswehr, when it formed in the 1950s, adopted weapons, philosophy much closer to American pragmatism than Wehrmacht tradition. Function over form became acceptable. Mass production was embraced. The cult of craftsmanship gave way to industrial efficiency. This shift reflected hard lessons learned through defeat. In modern warfare, the nation that could produce more weapons faster would prevail over the nation that produced fewer weapons better. The M3 grease gun's legacy extended beyond Germany. Military forces worldwide recognized that sustained conflict required industrial capacity as much as tactical skill. Weapons procurement shifted toward designs optimized for production rather than perfection. The stamped metal revolution that the M3 represented spread globally. By the Cold War, nearly every military had adopted some variant of cheap, mass-produced automatic weapons. The age of handcrafted arms had ended. Steiner himself became a machinist in post-war Germany, working in automotive plants that were rebuilding the shattered economy. He sometimes thought about the connection between his work and what he'd learned about the M3. The same principles applied: stamped components, spot welding, assembly line production. What had seemed crude in a weapon was simply efficient in a car. The techniques that had helped defeat Germany were now helping rebuild it. The irony wasn't lost on him. In his final years, Steiner gave occasional talks to history classes about his experiences. When students asked what surprised him most about fighting the Americans, he always mentioned the grease gun. "We thought their weapons looked cheap," he would say. And they were cheap, $20. But that was the point. They'd figured out that wars aren't won by who has the best equipment, but by who has the most equipment that's good enough. We never learned that lesson until too late. The M3's $20 price tag had symbolized a revolution in military thinking that Germany never embraced in time. Quality wasn't irrelevant, but it was subordinate to quantity in total war. Craftsmanship wasn't worthless, but it couldn't compete with mass production. The warrior ethos wasn't false, but it couldn't overcome industrial supremacy. These lessons had been written in stamped steel and wire stocks, in muddy battlefields and frozen forests, in the ruins of German cities and the abundance of American supply dumps. The grease gun story was ultimately about the transformation of warfare from an art to an industry. For centuries, war had been the domain of craftsmen and warriors, where individual skill and carefully made tools determined outcomes. The 20th century transformed war into a contest of industrial capacity, where production rates and resource bases mattered more than tradition or technique. Germany had entered World War II still thinking like craftsmen. America had approached it thinking like manufacturers. The outcome was never really in doubt. Klaus Steiner died in 1998, having lived long enough to see Germany reunified and the Cold War ended. In his possessions, his children found a small stamped steel component he'd kept since his capture. It was a magazine catch from an M3, a piece he'd somehow retained through processing and imprisonment. When asked why he'd kept such an odd souvenir, he'd always given the same answer: to remember that I was wrong. That we were all wrong about what mattered in war. That small piece of stamped metal, worth perhaps 20 cents of the weapon's $20 cost, represented a lesson that had been purchased at an immeasurable price. Modern warfare rewarded nations that could mobilize industry, not nations that could craft perfection. It favored systems that could produce adequate weapons by the millions over systems that could produce superior weapons by the thousands. It belonged to pragmatists who accepted good enough over perfectionists who demanded the best. The M3 grease gun had taught this lesson through its very existence, not through technical brilliance or innovative design, but through brutal simplicity and overwhelming quantity. It had been ugly, crude, cheap, and absolutely effective. It had helped defeat the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen, not despite its shortcomings, but in some ways because of them. The weapon that looked like a mistake had proven to be exactly what America needed, and in doing so, it had helped write the future of warfare itself. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.